what we will do after we'll let everybody sort of make opening statements as those cards can start coming down while they get going. But I'll turn it over to Jim here to just kind of set a stage for what he's seen.
Did you say over the last 10 years?
Well, I think it's kind of a decade of retrospection.
Okay, all right. First of all, hi, Joe and Rita. Nice to see you guys again. More than 30 years ago, I was the news director, or the State House reporter, and the news director at KANU, Kansas Public Radio, and then I've done various things in between, including working at the Topeka newspaper, and now working at KCUR with Sam and others. We have this Kansas News Service project, and we have a fairly significant sized staff in Topeka covering the State House, and we're about to have reporters attached to the Kansas News Service in Wichita and Garden City, in Kansas City, and here in Lawrence as well. So, I mean, obviously over the last 10 years, we've seen a great deal of change in Kansas politics. We went from Governors Sebelius and Parkinson to Governor Brownback, and then a few years after Governor Brownback took office, we saw essentially what was a Tuesday night massacre of a bunch of moderate Republicans, particularly in the Kansas Senate, and that was right after the tax bill passed. And Steve Morris, who was the president of the Senate, Pete Brungard from Salina, and a bunch of those Republicans were taken out of office. Ironically, most of the mailing and most of the campaign against them was they used Obamacare as a club, frankly, to take out state legislators here in Kansas who had nothing to do, of course, with the passage of that federal law. Nevertheless, what happened after that is conservative Republicans, had pretty much an iron grip on the legislature, controlled the legislature for several years, and that was, just skipping ahead pretty quickly, I think that was, was alluded to earlier this morning, that was broken in this last election cycle. Significant changes. A bunch of the Republicans who had been in charge looked at the landscape and decided not to run for re-election. Those who did, many of them, most of them had challengers, and many of those challengers were successful. Most Democrats challenging them and moderate Republicans, particularly in Johnson County, were successful. And that changed the complexion of the legislature pretty dramatically, I think. I'd like to hear what the other panelists say, but pretty quickly, a coalition of moderate Republicans and Democrats emerged early in the session, started meeting with one another. There were several different caucuses, including a women's caucus, and they held together there were a couple of stress points during the course of the session because of particular votes, but that coalition held together pretty well, and I think in the end prevailed. We saw that in the override vote. But what was also interesting, my final point, in that override vote at the very end, you had people who didn't vote for the tax increase bill, who voted to override. Republicans in particular, Dan Hawkins, Speaker Reichman. And I think there was a story that Brian Lowry wrote in the paper a couple of days that described the scene in the last couple of days, why a lot of the Republicans then abandoned the governor in the final days of the session. And so I think the dynamics, all of them are very interesting. And I do think, though, there's a lot of talk about whether state politics has reached a quote-unquote turning point. And I think that the next election cycle will have a lot to say about whether or not the state has truly turned the corner in those respects, because the gains in the legislature are significant. It'll be interesting to see whether those continue, and obviously the gubernatorial race will have a lot to do with that. So, pass it to the line.
So if we go back 10 years, I have been able to look at Kansas politics from afar. 10 years ago, I would have either been in Philadelphia or Minneapolis, watching my home state and watching the State Board of Education and wondering what happened. Then in the last few years since I've moved back, I've been able to look at it more intimately. And I just want to pick up on what Jim said. This week on the podcast that I do, State House Blend, we had Representative Holscher, Clayton, and Renan from Pittsburgh talking about the Women's Caucus, how it came together, and how it really, I think, helped break the logjam when they were talking about taxes. And I think Jim is right that that we saw that moderate Democratic loose coalition fray a couple of times, but in the end, it seemed to me that that middle ground that I think is really mostly Kansas politics. I think that middle ground seemed to hold. It swung back to where I think Kansas politics generally is. And the real question is going to be, how will the voters perceive that next year? How are they going to look at the last couple of years, 3 or 4 years in the legislature, and decide, you know, do we want to move away from that, or do we want to go back towards that? I mean, I think that it seems to me that it swung sort of back to that sort of middle ground that Kansas politics generally is. You know, early on in my career, and Jim knows this better than I, but you know, Kansas legislative sessions were generally kind of boring. They came in, they did their work. There would be some drama here and there, but for, you know, mostly they came in and got their work done. And the question will be, is that the kind of legislature that Kansas wants in the future, that comes in every year, gets their work done, keeps the drama to a minimum, and then gets out of town before you reach 114 days or 113 days or however long it was. So I think this is going to, you know, this past session is certainly has already set the stage for what the election cycle in 2018 is going to look like. I think that this is depending on I think what happens with school finance, and then certainly a big question mark about what's going to happen. What's going to happen with Governor Brownback, and are we going to have a Governor Collier? I think all of that will start to fine-tune what we're going to see in 2018. But I think that I think we have a pretty good idea of where Kansas voters are going to be in the next year.
Use this one maybe.
Okay.
Hello? Okay.
I think you got it.
That's a lot of mic there. So I spent 16 years full-time in the legislature as a staff person. Prior to that, I spent 2 years as an intern. So that would have made it 1998. So I've been there, wow, going on 20 years, I guess. And the biggest changes I've seen over the course of time, obviously, is the swing in ideology. You know, the pendulum has kind of swung back and forth, as the two previous panelists spoke about, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Another big change that I've seen is I've seen the quality of the legislator. When I started, either I was very naive or I felt like the quality of the legislator was much higher when I started as an intern in '98 and when I started full-time in 2000. And then I saw a number of people get elected, particularly in the last probably 6 to 8 years, that quite frankly were less inclined to talk about things that directly affected their constituents or things that they came up with themselves, and were more inclined to just come up with an ideology attached to a book that, you know, they kept in their back pocket, and they just stuck to the talking points and possibly didn't even understand what they were talking about. And the legislature became very driven by a partisan ideology and a very right-wing ideology. And the other thing I've seen a big change in is civility. You know, I'd like to tell the story to people that are new to the State House, or people that don't spend a lot of time in the State House, that when I started up there, during the first couple weeks of every new session, particularly right after an election, there are always new freshman legislators, Democrats, Republicans, that are very excited to get there. And when you run into them in the hallway, or you ride the elevator with them, years ago, they were very likely to extend their hand, introduce themselves, ask you who you were. And it usually went like this for me, because usually it was a Republican legislator and I was a Democratic staff. And they would say, well, hello, I'm Representative so-and-so from such and such county. Who are you? And I would say, well, I'm Tim Graham, I work for Senator Hensley. And he goes, oh, yeah, so you're a Democrat? And I'd say yes, and then they'd kind of give me a little bit of a tease, but they would say, very nice to meet you, and I would have a relationship with that person going on. I saw that change, particularly after the Brownback regime started coming in. They may or may not say hello to you when you got on the elevator in later years. A lot of people were up there with a big chip on their shoulder, again with that little book in their back pocket telling them how they should think, what they should think, and how they should act. If they did say hello to you and you told them that you were a Democratic staffer, there was about a 50% chance they'd never talk to you again. So the civility for a long time in the collegiality, I guess, was lacking compared to what it was when I started, and I'm starting to see that come back. Now, you know, the other thing I saw, and this was prior to the 2012 elections where the Tuesday night massacre, I saw progressives, both Democrat and Republican, because there are Republican progressives in the legislature, believe it or not. Of course, it's a sliding scale and everything is relative, but there are progressive Republicans in the legislature. And I saw this group of folks come together in the middle and actually have friendships and work together. In the beginning, that wasn't happening, and right probably after the special session, that coalition really started to form. That was still when Sebelius was in office, and that coalition kind of coalesced around education issues. And so they came together, and they stuck together pretty well, and that's why they ran him out of office in 2012. Here's the thing that bothers me about what's going on. I'm thrilled with what happened in the 2016 elections, both in the primary and in the general. However, and I see the coalition coming back together. It's a different coalition. It's some of the same people. It's some new people. But I don't have as much faith in the coalition as we sit here today as maybe Jim has, in terms of it got off to a rocky start. And what I see in the coalition right now is now that these people have been pushed back to the middle, the meat that is on the bones is now in the middle, you know, middle left, middle right. Now everybody's fighting over who gets the credit for education or highways or beating back Brownback. And I've seen a lot of individuals on both sides of the aisle who are still a little bit too ego-driven, and they need to get over themselves, and they need to get back to actually governing for what the people have sent them up to do. This was a wave election, and when you come up and you are going to fix the problems that Brownback created, nobody wants you to sit up there and take all the credit for it and say this was a Democratic victory, or this is a Republican victory, or this was a moderate victory, or you know, Legislator A or Senator B was the person that drove this train. Now, with one exception, something that was really, really cool and very promising at the end of the legislative session was this formation of the Women's Caucus. If there is a group that I believe put the pressure on those ego-driven people in the middle that were driving the train, if it was a group that put the pressure on them to do the right thing, it was the Women's Caucus. And that is something that I think is extremely strong. So again, the big things, the swinging ideology, we're getting back to where we need to be, but we need to check some of the egos at the door. The quality of legislator is back on the rise. We're having people that are thoughtful, are bringing their own ideas, and are willing to work together. And the civility is back on the rise. And I think that's something that we all should be excited about.
Now I'll tell you what really happened. This wasn't covered by the media or the political scientists that have been interviewed, but there were two organizations that made a fundamental change in the election last November and last August. They started actually 3 years ago, during the Davis Docking campaign. I don't know if you remember, I was field organizer for Davis Docking, Southeast Kansas, but you remember the 100 Republicans who came out for Davis? We had a media event at the Ramada. Winter from here in Lawrence brought together a lot of the folks who died in the massacre, Steve Morris and so on and so forth. They came out for Davis against Brownback 3 years ago. Well, that group went on to form the Save Kansas Coalition. And full disclosure, I'm a board member of the Save Kansas Coalition. It's a 501c4, which means it's like Coke on steroids. We had out-of-state money, over $500,000, and we hammered the crap out of some of those conservative legislators, especially in the primary. We hired full-time staff. We sent out mailers that would make you blush. Every single mailer had a picture of the incumbent along with a picture of Brownback and nasty, nasty stuff. And it worked. We hammered mostly senators, but some representatives, and they were defeated. The second organization that caused the change is my baby, the Johnson County Voting Coalition. One of the things that I came away from the Davis Docking campaign was we lost in Johnson County. We did not turn out the vote, it was our fault. So I have an interest in going where the votes are. You know, a quarter of the votes are there, a quarter of the population, a quarter of the legislature. And they were ready for change. So after I left the Davis Docking campaign, I became a field coordinator for the ACLU of Kansas, went around the state organizing local activities in Manhattan, KCK, here in Lawrence. Well, in Johnson County, they were so pissed at Chris Kobach, they wanted to do voter engagement. So the ACLU members formed a task force on voter engagement in Johnson County, and they decided to invite like-minded organizations, Mainstream Coalition, True Blue Women, Women for Kansas, League of Women Voters, so on and so forth. At each meeting, more organizations would come. We now have 35 partners. These are all progressive organizations, some political. Your Douglas County Dems are in it because Kurt's on the mailing list. He gets all of our information. So things are going fine until about February of 2 years ago when Michael Kubik, the executive director of ACLU, called me in and said, you guys are getting too political. You're threatening our 501c3. You're going to have to make a decision. So I resigned and I became the coordinator for the Johnson County Voting Coalition, which we call Joe Votes. We recruited candidates. We brought together members of the coalition. One of the things that happened in Johnson County is these interest groups popped up. Stand Up Blue Valley, which is the media characterized them as a bunch of stay-at-home moms. Well, I attended their meetings. These women were accountants. They're accountants, lawyers, physicians. They are really sharp folks. And they knew how to deal with issues, they knew how to work with candidates, raise money. Save Kansas Coalition gave them $6,000 and they put it to good use. What we did is we brought together all of these interest groups to pool their resources, to focus their activities, and to get people elected, and they did it. After the election in November, on November 30th, Joe Votes called together 21 of the legislators we supported who were elected, and we brought them to the French Community Center in Merriam for a little cookies and punch time to talk, and we basically told them we expect you to play well in the legislature. We had 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats who were returning to the legislature as a panel to talk to the newbies about what I wish I knew when I first came to the legislature. And we've continued to do that to promote that collaboration and cooperation with them. We're having another meeting July 18th at the same place to thank them for their activities in the legislature. And we're going to have their back because the attacks have already started on them. So-and-so raised your taxes. We're going to be continuing to, especially in social media. We're very big in social media. So these 2 organizations are what made a difference in the election. The bad news, and trust me, I'm a yellow dog Democrat. I was born that way. I vote Democrat. I'm on Paul Davis's exploratory committee. The bad news is, and this is a story everybody has missed, the political parties were totally irrelevant in this last election. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party were irrelevant. It was the interest groups that came together, the Save Kansas Coalition, hear the word coalition, and the Johnson County Voting Coalition. That's where the action is, and that's where the change is going to come in the future.
I just want to push back a little bit, because I'm serious about this. I don't want to pick a fight here, but I think Steve is right in a lot of respects, and I think it's true, a lot of organizations came together behind the scenes and made a huge difference, particularly in Johnson County this last election. But that wasn't ignored by the media, and our characterization and our coverage of Stand Up Blue Valley, et cetera, has been anything but the way you characterized it. We understood the grassroots movements, various of them, were extremely powerful and extremely influential in the last election. I will also just put this into the conversation because I think it bears, we're having a looking forward conversation here, and I would ask Steve, as a member of the Save Kansas Coalition, looking ahead to the 2018 race for governor.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Looking ahead to the 2018 race for governor, is Greg Orman going to run?
Yes,
Then that pretty much, what's that do to the Democratic candidate?
that hurts.
Yes,
Yeah.
it gives Kobach the governorship potentially. So let's have a conversation about that.
I got this. To say that the parties were irrelevant is not the truth. I strongly disagree with you. How much money did you guys raise?
Didn't need money, zero.
You just said how much money you raised and what an impact that was on the election.
The Save Kansas Coalition raised $500,000. Johnson County Voting Coalition,
As
zero.
did the Senate Democrats. We put 40 candidates in every seat. We had a challenger for every person that was on the ballot in the Senate side that was a Republican. The House Democrats did the same thing, and with the help of the state party, we made bigger gains in Kansas than any state in the nation except, I believe, New Hampshire. It could be Connecticut, but I believe it was New Hampshire, where they picked up 26 Democratic seats. We picked up 14 here, and we did it because we worked with Save Kansas, believe me, and we worked together as a coalition, House, Senate, and Democratic Party. And our people, these people out here, worked as well. So we're anything but irrelevant. And we were as much a part of the legislative gains in the general election as Save Kansas was. So, not today, buddy.
So Kurt pitched this idea of being a moderator as a sleepy job that I couldn't possibly screw up. I want to thank Steve for making this exciting this morning, but I will ask a question once again, and Jim brought this up once, I don't even want to call it conventional political wisdom, but I think it's established that there's not space for both a Democrat and an incumbent, and an independent in a gubernatorial race or any other race that doesn't hand that to the Republican nominee. If that is Chris Kobach, I think that poses a real problem for the state of Kansas. So Steve, do you want to respond a bit to what the addition of a third party into a state that really doesn't have space for it does when that potential candidate that then is victorious is Chris Kobach, someone that I think we all universally say would be very bad for the state?
Well, I can't speak for Greg Orman, but I just know that he's going to do it. It scares the hell out of me. I don't like it at all. I don't like third-party candidates. One of the things that I've been doing is here in Lawrence and in Johnson County is we've got a lot of people who are mobilized right now, but they're not organized. You know, these indivisible groups and huddles and so forth, and they're doing rallies and marches and town halls for Jerry Moran or whatever. I was on a panel for one in Olathe. We had 250 chairs set up and 650 people showed up. One of the things that I've been telling people is you've got to get organized, you've got to get involved in a political party. And we've been, the Johnson County Voting Coalition does a great deal on voter registration. We do our voter registering in northeast Johnson County. We don't do any in Olathe. Does that tell you something? We're registering blue folks. That's how we're increasing the power. And when I tell people to pick a party, there's no choice. I say you can't register. Most of these young people are registering as unaffiliated. That's not good. They've got to get involved with a party, and the only party is the Democratic Party. So Greg Orman lost to Pat Roberts because he had no get out the vote. He had a lot of his money, but no get out the vote.
So, do you want to respond?
Yeah. So my take on the Orman effect, Chad Taylor and the Senator Roberts, I have I have a completely different perspective on how that race could have turned out if we would have had 3 candidates. I think, and again, I'm not a blind, loyal follower of everything that party establishment does, but I think one of the biggest mistakes we did was to have people talk Chad Taylor into getting out of the race. Now, hey, never seen you clap for me before, thank you. Yeah. Look, we could have won that race with 34% of the vote. I didn't think that Ormond was going to siphon off as much of the Democratic votes as people thought he was. I think we were way too, and I like Greg Ormond. I've met him a couple times. He's a really nice guy. He probably should be a Democrat, at least from his ideological perspective. But I mean, they hadn't even counted all the votes in the Democratic primary that year, 14, when people were already saying, we got to get Taylor off the ballot, we got to get Taylor off the ballot. That was a huge mistake. To me, that was like going in and playing with the political gods. You just don't go in and mess with the political structure that is supposed to be there. There's supposed to be a Democratic candidate. There's supposed to be a Republican candidate. And if a third-party candidate gets in there, then so be it. What happened, as you all know, and this is political 101, Ormond became the default Democrat in that race, and all that money that came flying in here to save Pat Roberts actually got Sam Brownback elected. So that should be a lesson that all party leaders, all people that care about the future of this state and are helping and recruiting candidates and working on campaigns, they always have to harken back to the Senate election of 2014 and the unintended consequences of messing with the political gods. Chad Taylor should have just been allowed to stay in there, make his case. He could have won with 34% of the vote. Ormond could have won with 34% of the vote. But what we did was that was a big mistake we made, and we're paying the price big time right now. I won't say bigly, but big time.
So we'll move to a question that was brought forward by the audience to kind of lighten the mood. This is a fun one to think about. With respect to political advertising, do you think it's more effective to link a Republican candidate to Governor Brownback or President Trump? Or I believe an ad in candidate Kobach. So how do you parse this out in the 2018 election? I'll let anybody grab that if they want it. Sam, you're not holding a mic, and I think you want one.
He always wants one.
Yeah, that's why I'm in radio. I have to say that I'm not sure that we can tell right now. I think in the coming months, by the beginning of the year, I think we'll know who Democrats are going to yoke their opponents to. I think it certainly depends on what happens. Should Brownback leave? Should Trump or any people in his orbit be impeached or indicted? So I think it is, as if I could just speak off the record, I think it might be a target-rich environment as they go forward. But certainly they're going to yoke them to somebody, and I think we just have to. I think we're going to have to wait a little bit to see how that plays out.
I think Tim made a good point. When you watch the dynamics of this legislative session unfold, you saw the conservative Republicans left in the legislature sitting back and essentially paying attention to every vote, pushing some votes, engineering some votes, essentially designing their postcard campaign as the legislative session unfolded. But just as strictly as a nonpartisan observer of the political process, heading into the 2018 election, given the landscape as it exists right now, Kobach has ties to Trump, Brownback has ties to Trump. Essentially, I think you lump all three of them together. I mean, they all stand essentially for the same thing in terms of policies. And so I think, as Sam said, just as a political observer, it does appear at the moment to be a target-rich environment, but an awful lot can change between now and then.
Another question, kind of tying in with that. What do you think, if you're prognosticating the primary for the Republicans in 2018, the Democrats had large gains in 2016, but the moderate Republicans for sure did as well, and it may be a tougher environment for them. Do you think that changes? Do you think Ed O'Malley helps their case? I'll let anyone grab that one.
Everybody here know who Ed O'Malley is? Show of hands. Can you raise your hand if you know who Ed O'Malley is? Okay, interesting right there. Ed's a former state legislator from Johnson County, Republican. I did an interview with him recently. He really doesn't want to be saddled at the moment with the moderate label. He's not, he is in effect a moderate probably, was part of the coalition that Tim alluded to that emerged initially around when Governor Sebelius was in office around the school finance and education issues. He was part of that movement. But Ed is in the race on the Republican side along with Wink Hartman, who is a business person from Wichita, an oil executive. Everybody knows that Chris Kobach recently announced his candidacy. Jim Barnett, who's a former state senator from Emporia, who is now practicing medicine in Topeka, is going to announce his candidacy next week. Many people may have forgotten he was the nominee against Kathleen Sebelius when she ran for her second term in office. And so, I don't know how to, at this moment, I would characterize Jim. When I knew him when he was first in the state senate, he was definitely a little bit farther right than center right probably, but I don't know how we would characterize him today. I have a really hard time handicapping the Republican primary and how well the moderates will do. I think a lot of it depends on turnout in various parts of the state and other events that can affect just the political dynamics both in the state and the country relative to Trump and Kobach and all those things. But it was clear to me, one thing I will say, it was clear to me when Kobach announced his candidacy the other day, he had an opportunity to start distancing himself from Brownback's fiscal policies, and he didn't. He doubled down on them. He was highly critical of the legislature for passing the tax increase bill, and so that tells me that at least he's thinking that he can win the Republican nomination with that conservative base, and in a three-way race for governor, might well be able to win the race for governor with that same base, not having to extend beyond it.
Republican primary for governor, Barnett, O'Malley, Kobach, Hartman. I'm not sure if anybody else will enter into the race. But if you look back to 2010 when Kobach ran in the Republican primary for Secretary of State, it was a three-way primary. And you had Kobach, you had Elizabeth Hensley. Was it? Yeah, Hensley? No. Libby Hensley. Yeah, she was the Shawnee County election officer at the time. She was probably considered the moderate. Then there was J.R. Clays. He was young, ambitious. He's now in the State House as a representative. Lives just down the street here, but represents Salina. He was heavily self-funded. I think he spent maybe $250 grand of his own money in a Republican primary. And neither one of them, and he ran as a conservative, neither one of them even came close to Kobach. In our lifetime, at the state level, there are certain candidates that, on both sides of the spectrum, that the masses will walk into the gates of hell with. One of those was Phil Klein. The conservatives would not have abandoned him for anything. Back in 2002 when he ran that primary against David Adkins for Attorney General. And I don't think the conservatives will abandon Kobach for anything. My prediction is unless another really big name conservative gets in the race, and he or she would do so just because of a personal conflict with Kobach, not an ideological conflict. That's the only way that I think he gets knocked off in that primary. I would be surprised too if we don't see 2 or 3 more people float their names out there, and then this list get whittled down to about 3 by the time we're really in primary mode. And I've got to believe that Kobach's coming out of that primary.
So this is a question, Steve, you may want to handle some of this, but I put it out to the other 3 of you as well. Johnson County, everybody, it's turning bluer for sure. We're registering a lot more people, but we were also doing that in 2014. Paul ran an extremely effective race there and still lost the county. Does it turn finally this year, or do we continue pouring time and resources and effort into it and it continues to disappoint?
Well, there's a lot of purple in Johnson County. If you go, obviously Olathe is very conservative, but OP, you get up into northeast. One of the problems we've had, and my coalition has worked very hard to get collaboration amongst the legislatures, especially the moderate R's and the Ds. When we picked our candidates in the primary, it was pretty easy. You pick your favorite Republican, you pick your favorite Democrat, put your resources in. Now we get to the general election last November, and we've got a really good Democrat and a really good moderate R running against each other. What do you do? I mean, you're going to be happy whichever way it turns out, but there's a lot of animosity in Johnson County about Northeast Johnson County should be more Democrat, and a lot of the moderate Rs get a lot of heat because they're moderate Rs. And I have to tell you, having worked in Johnson County for 2 years, I've learned a lot. Those moderate Rs get a lot of shit. They get it from the conservatives, they get it from the Democrats, they get it from other folks that they don't deserve. They have zero support from the county or the state party. You can't get a precinct appointment in Johnson County because we recruit precinct people there. There are 500 precincts, over 2,000 precinct positions in Johnson County. You're a Republican and you're on the wrong side of abortion, you don't get appointed. So we're trying to rebuild, we're trying to retake the Republican Party in Johnson County as well, and it's one tough row to hoe. So we support the moderate R's, we support Democrats, we support progressive legislators, and the interest groups are changing the tone and the tenor and the conversation. One of the things that surprised me during this legislative session is that a lot of our partners were supporting each other. So the medical marijuana people will support the Medicare expansion bill if you'll support my bill next time around. There was actually sharing of making phone calls on behalf of other folks' issues. This is a huge move. Compiling and combining your resources to lobby legislatures, combining them to elect better legislators. I think it's going to turn more blue, but definitely I'm counting on purple too.
Do you want to say that as I went to a lot of community organizations and community meetings, Mainstream Coalition, Stand Up the Valley, Game On, that there was oftentimes Republican and Democratic candidates there together, talking about the same things. Actually, at some times you would see them on social media campaigning in the same neighborhoods at the same time. If it was a state senate race and a state representative race. And so I think some of those lines got blurred a little bit. Not so much in the northeast part of the county, which is pretty moderate and pretty Democrat, but as you got into the southern part of the county, which is pretty conservative, I think they did change the tenor and the tone, these community groups, by bringing together and sort of blurring the lines between a moderate Republican and a Democrat. Did that hold? Absolutely during the session it did not, but certainly I saw that during the campaign.
In looking at Johnson County, so to go back to your original question, is Johnson County going to turn blue, or is it going to continue to disappoint? I think we have to look at it in terms of, okay, what races are we talking about? Certainly we want Johnson County to vote for a whole host of Democratic candidates at the statewide level. Governor, Secretary of State.
Congress.
Well, yeah, that's not statewide though, but I'm getting to that. Yeah. And then at the congressional level, obviously we want them, and we've done that many a times in the last 20 years with Dennis Moore. But at the legislative level, here's what's tricky. The Johnson County media market is just cost prohibitive for legislative candidates. And so Democrats do not get the benefit of the doubt in Kansas. We just don't. And that's okay. We are a Republican state. we're a progressive Republican state, if you know anything about our history. But everybody tends to come from a Republican family tree, it seems like, except me. I'm just kidding. We have to be able to communicate to the voters out there that are willing to vote blue. And the old-fashioned way of communicating, which is mail and some of those mediums, they are becoming less and less effective every campaign cycle. Telephones are becoming less effective. Mail is becoming less effective. Now, I'm not advocating that we do away with those by any means. We still have to try to have maximum reach to every voter that we can in every different type of avenue that we can, so we can reach everybody. But the best medium right now for reaching people is television. And in Johnson County, you have two problems. One is the Kansas City media market is probably 3 to 4 times as much for a gross rating point that it is in Topeka and Wichita or Western Kansas. The other thing is even if you have enough money to spend on television, you're completely diluted over there, because you also have who's ever running on the Missouri side. You have presidential politics, because Missouri is usually a swing state. So you're going to have, in the last election, you're going to have Hillary ads running on television. You're going to have Trump ads running on television. You're going to have Nixon ad. Nixon didn't run last time.
Right.
Yeah, you said it best. You're going to have all these Missouri campaigns that are being run on the television, and that drives the cost up, and that just dilutes the small amount of time that the average voter is going to allow you to have in their minds and on their television screen. So I don't know how to do it. I'm not an organizer, but we need to figure out a way of being able to get past that benefit of the doubt and getting out to those voters and giving them a reason to vote blue with the challenges we have with not being able to afford TV.
I just want to say that our most effective candidates used social media, Twitter, Facebook, coming up with cute little ads and then memeing them and sending them on to friends. We had, especially our younger folks, because they're much more comfortable with it. I had one senatorial candidate who's my age who refused to do social media, and I really think it damaged him. But it's cheap, it's quick, it's current, you keep it moving. Most of our coalition people have these large listservs, hundreds of folks that they send stuff out to. And those, you put together a 2-minute clip. Cindy Holscher got a fabulous clip. Brett Parker had a great clip. Bag of groceries in Overland Park and a bag of groceries in Kansas City, Missouri, and saying what the difference in the price was. It was very cool. And it went out to everybody. So social media is cheap and effective.
Let's have one more question. Quickly.
Oh, one more question. All right. I thought I was getting the universal sign for the calf is tied from Kurt. We'll go one more. How can we, the Democratic Party, support bipartisan caucuses like the Women's Caucus? Are there potential pitfalls there, or because they include everyone from Representative Ballard to Senate President Susan Wagle, or is it good to support them?
Yeah, Dan talking about a women's coalition.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I'm passing the mic.
Well, I just interviewed 3 of them, so let me just try to say what they told me on the podcast. First, Susan Wagle wasn't part of the Women's Coalition that formed, and it was pretty organic. It didn't happen at the beginning of the session. Happened near the end. It was, as it was described to me, that nobody really came in there thinking they were going to write legislation, that they just wanted to get the log jam moving. Turns out that as they listened to ideas and they brought in others, and they were particularly had a lot of praise for the chairman of the tax committee in the House, who came in and they felt that Steve Johnson had given them a lot of guidance, and that he was supportive of what they were doing. And I guess the question is, and Tom Sawyer, who is the ranking member. They also mentioned him, thank you, Representative Ballard, but I just want to say that there was maybe 51% praise for Steve and 49% for Don. And I think they may have been surprised that the Republican chairman came in and was so, at least the way they described it to me, so willing to work with them. And so is the question, so if you support that kind of bipartisan work, does that dilute the Democratic brand, or does it dilute the Republican brand? I don't know, maybe it does, but at the end, I think that they came up with a pretty good bill, and they did what we want people to do when they go to Topeka, and that is work together and move out legislation and do good things for Kansas.
I think it'd be interesting to ask Representative Ballard this question specifically. I mean, she was right in the middle of it, but I do think it comes down to having a policy focus once the election is over. And I mean, Tim alluded to this in his earlier remarks about people coming to Topeka, literally showing up to adhere to a specific agenda, not to do the work in front of them. And I think one of the things that we saw that was different this session, that does harken back to the older days, my first legislative session was 1982, is that once the election is over, the people who arrived in Topeka, whether they were Democrat or Republican, had campaigned on the theme of, quote unquote, fixing the mess in Topeka. So the job at hand was to fix the mess. It wasn't to advance partisan politics or partisan one way or the other, with the exception of the people who Tim alluded to, who let their egos get the best of them at the end and then were put back in their place by the Women's Caucus, appropriately so. But I think it comes down to getting back to the notion of governing once an election is over. And I think that is the key to making any coalition, bipartisan or not, work in the end.
And having people, partisan people, support that work.
Last Tuesday, I had dinner with two moderate Republicans in Johnson County, Lindy Gallagher and Joy Keston. And I was really curious about this women's caucus thing. And they told me an amazing story. These women brought in experts with flip charts and PowerPoints to explain the nuances of taxing levels and so on and so forth. And one of the things that these women told me is that they changed minds. Legislators were nodding their heads saying, oh, I never thought of it that way. That's damn good politics. I would encourage that. And having had a lot of experience with coalitions, it's always about value. You go to a coalition to increase your value, but there's also, you got to give up a little bit. So guess what? Coalitions have to compromise. Have we heard that word in the legislature lately? My hat is off to the women's caucus, or whatever you want to call it. We need more of that.
Or Mike again. Coalition governing is fun, it's effective, and it's rewarding. Probably two of the best years I ever spent as staff in the Kansas legislature were the first 2 years of the Brownback administration. We didn't really accomplish a lot, but we stopped a lot of bad things from happening. And that's why they went after the moderates so with such ferocity. We have to have a coalition government in Kansas. Democrats that are good leaders in the Kansas legislature understand that. They build strong friendships and coalitions with people across the aisle. Representative Ballard works very well on the mental health issue with her Republican colleagues. You ended up with that in the final budget bill, didn't you? You got exactly what you wanted. That was due to her willingness to work across the aisle and find friends on the other side of all political stripes. They don't just have to be moderates or progressive Republicans. You can even work with conservatives at times on certain issues. These coalitions are a must in Kansas if progressives want to get even a fraction of what we believe we need and deserve and the things that we think are going to make the state better. So if you're not willing to put your ego aside, if you're not willing to work with the other side, then you're not doing progressives in this state any favors. You know, as a lobbyist is what I do now for an organization, association. I spent a lot of time in my former office, mainly because I could find a padded chair and a table in there, and I could listen to the House and the Senate debates. And I can't count on my hands and feet how many times I had, and this was Senator Hensley's conference room, which is also his office. I can't count on how many times I had to get up and leave because a Republican senator would come in there and want to talk to the Democratic leader of the Senate about some legislation or some other legislation. And so that was a good sign. They were working together, and we have to have that.
Why wasn't Representative Ballard on this panel? She's here in the audience, she should have been up on the panel.
We were invited.
I think this is probably a non-elected, and I don't want to speak for the county, but I would imagine the county does an elected panel as well, which is a different and arguably more valid, but this was just a different perspective. Don't bother.
We will have her, don't worry.
Yeah. This is the conclusion of our program. I want to thank our panelists and everybody in the audience. And we'll be up in the lobby if anybody wants to talk to anybody. Thank you.
Thank you.